All right, today I'm talking with Martin Bisi. Martin's at his longtime studio, Bisi Studios. Chances are, lots of the records in your record collection, Martin had a hand in creating. How long have you been doing this, Martin?
Well, in this recording studio right here, it's been since January of 1981. So this year was the 40th anniversary. I actually wish we could have done a bit of a celebration in the studio as we did at the 35th anniversary, but COVID happened.
Sure. And you had a
But
documentary done too, as well, right?
yeah, and there's a documentary called Sound and Chaos, the story of BC Studio, and yeah, that came out in like 2013 or something, 14.
So,
And
yeah,
but I've been
any idea of how many recordings you've had your hand in?
Well, there was a time, and I think I might have gotten it a little off, but there was a time like a decade ago, or maybe even 15 years ago, where I tried to calculate how many just pieces of things, right? So that back then it was long enough back that I was really thinking about hard copies. So it might have
Yeah.
even been late 90s or 2000. So I was really thinking of like, everything. So if there was an album and then there was a physical single, that would also be something I would count. And when I counted it all up, I was sort of approaching 2000. And now that seems like, wow, that's extremely high. Maybe I was just a lot more prolific and we spent a lot less time on albums back then and just kicked them out. Because now it seems like every album has a bit of an arc in the studio of a couple months at least. So things overlap, but it's hard to imagine that kind of pace. But let's say now, like I guess decades after I made that calculation, that maybe it really is like 2000. So it's thousands of recordings.
All right. Well, clearly we're not going to be able to go over all of those. So, what I would like to focus on today is the very early part. In fact, the very start of your music career. And as I've mentioned to you and the people on my blog, I'm working on a book called the Gomelski Recordings. So I want to focus a little bit on how Giorgio Gomelski was involved in your early career and that of the people around you, and how he ends up introducing you to Bill Laswell and all of that. Then we'll get into some of the details on some of those early material recordings and some other recordings that were done around that time. So we're going to be looking at a time from like 78 to 81,
Yeah. And
which
that's
is like,
actually because you asked me how long I've been doing it, and 81 is when I started in this recording studio. But there
sure,
was a handful of times just before that where I was kind of getting my feet wet with other recordings in other places. Basically, we didn't have the studio yet, but
sure.
we were actually like dipping our toes into the recording world enough that actually those early recordings that were not done at the studio was sort of prompting Bill Laswell to start thinking it would be nice to have a recording studio like a home base.
Sure, and I'm some of those early, and they must be some of the first recordings that you were involved with, include people like Brian Eno. So how big, how lucky is that? I suppose. Anyway, we're going to find out how you got involved in that. But first, before we get into how you meet Laswell and all that, let's get into how you get interested in music and what you're doing in New York City in 77, 78.
Well, I was always sort of, I guess, what you would call in the stoner crew in high school. I went to school in the North Bronx, where disco was king, really, at that time, like 76, 75, 76, 77. And increasingly it was all about disco. There was not really a lot of rock in any kind of sense. At least that's the impression I had. So it was like a small clique of people that were into really prog. There was a lot of like my crew, including people I wrote graffiti with, were really listening to a lot of prog. So we were listening to stuff like Yes and Frank Zappa, and even we were all about all about Kraftwerk, in 1977 with um, Trans Europe Express,
Sure.
and that's actually a bit of a little sub thread that a lot of these graffiti artists before the onset of like hip hop were actually listening to prog music.
Yeah.
Someone like someone like Vincent Gallo, right, the director who was dabbling in graffiti around that time. Also, he was a big Yes fan, and I was a big
Sure.
Yes fan. Even my Puerto Rican buddies, we were on the subway. What do you think we were listening to at a boombox? There was no hip hop yet. We weren't listening to Latin music. We were listening to like Prague, and everyone loved Kraftwerk, Trans Europe Express, because it was about trains. So we were on the
Yeah.
on the trains, bombing the trains, as we used to call it, tagging up. And I started tagging up, and that's significant here, I think, because that was really my introduction into counterculture in 1975. And actually, my tag then was Alive in 75. So that puts a nice stamp on it that can't be
Yeah,
denied.
it's interesting you mentioned the Prague connection because Gomelski, that's kind of how I got interested in him. When I found out that he was involved with you guys, and then I looked into his career, he also was involved before getting involved with you. He was involved with bands like Magma and Soft Machine, and going back to the very first recordings with the Yardbirds, when the Yardbirds were kind of helping to invent psychedelic rock. So Gomelski to me looked like one of these characters who was always pushing music, to a new direction, or looking for a new direction to go, or looking for people to take music in a new direction. So I want to get to that later. But so you're in New York City, and are you still in high school at this point when you're exploring the New York music scene?
Well, I didn't really start it. The first thing I did, say like 1975, I started writing graffiti. Sometime in 1977, so just a couple years after that, I was really hanging around with a lot of high school bands. And weirdly enough, one of the high school bands, called 1121, was almost just like the four digits. That was almost a pre-material, a proto-material, because it involved Fred Marr and Michael Beinhorn.
Oh, wow.
Before they met Bill Laswell. So this was like in the high school circuit. I mean, they weren't playing high school dances actually, but they were playing. I remember one show at the, I think it was like art and design, or I think it was, or music and art. One of those like public arts high schools in Manhattan, and we did a big show there, like in the school auditorium, and I ran the fog machines and stuff. And that was pre-material, but yet was Fred Marr on drums, already with his rototoms,
Wow.
right? Yeah, those tunable.
And how old is Fred Marr at this point?
At that point, he's supposed to be like, at that point, he was probably 13. So I met him when, I feel like I want to say that I met him when he was 13, but that was Michael Beinhorn then, who was still in high school, and I was a year younger than Michael, so I was definitely in high school. And
any recordings of that old band?
I don't know. But what's interesting is I remember flyering around the Upper East Side, if you can imagine, the Upper East Side of Manhattan. That's where the school was, kind of near Midtown. I remember flyering on the street. And it was like the 1121 was sort of like a mock-up of like the New York City skyline in the numbers 1121, and it said New York's best progressive rock, which is a little embarrassing in retrospect, but hey, so that was obviously like the language that we were all into. This was also a bit of a guilty pleasure, because I already was sensing that the punk in the background was not prog friendly. So once I started actually venturing into the New York scene, I kind of kept that a little bit to myself. I didn't throw the word prog around with any kind of like badge of honor.
No, but man, the influence was still there, right? I mean, what becomes the no wave scene was picking up influences from everywhere. That was kind of the whole point of the thing, right? Was mixing up the pot and creating something new.
Well, I think I think there was a strong innovative streak with no wave,
right?
But also, really, it was an answer to new wave.
Sure.
So no wave was supposed to be less accessible, less cleaned up, and was supposed to be a little truer to at least the stated spirit of punk.
Right.
And yet new wave was sort of like a comfy, marketable and we all actually liked new wave, but it was supposed to be a more marketable, more appealing, more accessible version
Yeah, more
of
pop.
punk. That's right. So that's why they called it new wave. So
Sure.
no wave was supposed to be almost like anything, that happened in New York City that
Right.
was sort of deliberately, boldly unaccessible or inaccessible could be kind of considered no wave. So it was actually a very broad genre that included what I used to call like mutant dance music, right? So there'd be like, which Material was kind of doing, so you would
Yeah.
have these sort of like stilted. The Material always had a good drummer, right? But imagine Material with a not the greatest drummer, and suddenly you get this like stilted kind of like more robotic, stiff
Yeah.
kind of like wannabe dance music or pseudo dance music kind of,
Yeah.
because a lot of the stuff would get played in clubs anyway. That's
Sure.
where we were introduced to a lot of music. There was no college radio, so it was really getting introduced to stuff listening at the Mud Club and just hearing music being
So,
played by the DJ.
that no wave scene that was developing then is what attracted the attention of Eno, and kind of is what got you eventually involved with Eno. But before we get into that, you're with Beinhorn and Maher, and at some point you guys become roommates. Is that right?
Yeah, I became roommates with Michael. I'm not clear exactly when. It might very well be when I. It might very well be. Oh, actually, I think I know the timeline. My dad died. My dad died in the fall of '78. So when my dad died in fall of '78, I quickly, like within 2 or 3 months during high school, moved down the hill, and I moved to like a much cheaper apartment that was sort of kept my routine of being able to take the subway up to the Bronx for classes for school. And that's where I became roommates with Michael Beinhorn. So it
Were you guys
clearly,
going to the same school?
no, we didn't go to the same school, but we were a bit in that same we were in the same music oriented high school scene. So at that point, Michael, I think, because he was a year older than me, so I think he'd already graduated. So that's when he moved in with me on 93rd Street between First Avenue and York.
So how did you meet him in the first place if you weren't at the same school?
Well, I knew. First of all, it's like I knew people from the neighborhood, a couple of kids from the neighborhood that because they were in my neighborhood, right?
Uh-huh.
Across the street, and then a couple of them knew people in some of the local like high school bands that would play dances. I remember some of those specifically, and then somewhere in there would overlap into Michael and Fred. So somehow in that stew, I ran into, I made friends with Michael and Fred.
So
It could have also been
Michael and Fred Maher, they were did they go to the same school together, or
that I'm not sure of.
Yeah.
I want to say
because
no.
there was quite an age difference, right? I mean,
Yeah,
about
I would say
3 years,
was that?
3 year age difference, or maybe more.
Yeah,
with
I would say 3, could be 4, but yeah,
Uh-huh.
definitely 3. And I also could have met Fred via a girlfriend of his, because I kind of remember him seeing someone, and then I kind of knew her because she was. So it was really just like within, connect the dots within the scene and neighborhood. And that's the time when we would hang out on the street, right? So you would actually, meet all kinds of people.
Right. So you and Beinhorn are roommates, and the story has it that Bill Laswell puts an ad in one of the newspapers looking for musicians. At this point, Laswell has already met Gomelski. Gomelski has just shown up in New York in '78. He had been working with the avant-garde in Europe mostly, and in '78 he decides to try and move some of that European avant-garde scene to New York because he's really excited about what's going on in New York. He soon sees Bill Laswell playing in clubs and decides that he wants to encourage Bill to put a band together. And he invites Bill to basically crash and rehearse at Gomelski's place. Somewhere in there is when Bill Laswell puts in this ad. Can you tell me a little bit about that? About how you hooked up with Laswell, and is this story about the ad the way it happened?
As far as I know, it was an ad because, and it makes sense. How would Fred and Michael, who lived uptown, way
Yeah.
uptown, 93rd. I lived with Michael on 93rd Street, and Bill was on 24th Street. In New York City, that's like, forget about it, right? That's very far. And we were all of us were much younger, particularly Fred, much younger than Bill, because Laswell was like, I want to say 24 around this time. And so the ad just actually does make sense. That's the impression I got. I also remembered because I was hanging out with Michael. I mean, I remember going with Michael Beinhorn to hang out in Central Park and like lay on the grass in the middle of the night and like philosophize as we looked up at the firmament of stars and stuff. So we were like definitely in that mode of like teenagers like suddenly coming into this life. And so and we were doing that almost daily. And then I realized at one point, I hadn't really seen Fred and Michael in like a good week, something like that. Not long, but enough that I took note. And then they said that they made this great guy called Bill, and that they wanted, and that they told him about me, and he said he'd like to meet me, and somehow in there, I guess, encouraged me, or I was
Sure.
like, sure. I don't know what they told Bill, but at the time I was in the theater class in high school and was generally showing an interest in things of the stage. Also, as you recall my saying that Fred Marr and Michael Beinhorn at that point were still in this band called 1121, which was this like wannabe progressive band of teenagers on the Upper East Side. And I helped them with shows. Like I helped them. So the whole idea of my sort of being part of a collective and helping with technical stuff was already there even before
Sure.
Bill. So because I remember
But they're
specific.
answering this ad that Bill put in. So they must have been looking for other bands to join or hook up with in some way. Do you remember what activity you and they were involved in before actually going to meet Bill Laswell?
Yeah, well, I don't think that they had a lot of musical prospects. The only band that was happening was 1121, and it might have already been waning at that point. So I could see them wanting to look for broader pastures.
So they
Um,
may have been answering other ads or looking at. I mean, I'm sure they were. Yeah.
that could very well be true. Also, I think I remember that the ad specified influences, and
Uh-huh.
that resonated with Michael and Fred. And then since I was already trying to help bands out, right, like helping with staging and running
Yeah.
the fog machine, I think that Bill saw an opportunity there of my being part of a team.
All right. So
Yep.
these guys have hooked up with Bill and had some kind of initial meeting, and seems like hit it off basically. Um, and they come back and tell you about this. When can you remember like the first time you met Bill and Giorgio?
Uh, well, when I went to meet Bill, I might have seen Giorgio in the background, but I don't really remember meeting him.
Uh-huh.
But what I did is I walked into Zoo House.
That was Gomelski's place, right?
Yeah, so I walked in to meet Bill. I walked into Zoo House, and this was middle of the day, and there was a rehearsal by John Zorn. I believe it was a game piece because there was a lot of people there, and I specifically remember walking in and observing Eugene Chadbourne playing guitar with like found objects like balloons or something,
Wow.
and I was completely blown away because also I was very much my heroes were guitar heroes at that point, right? Like Jimi Hendrix. My heroes played guitar based music. So when I heard this crazy avant-garde music, which it really was abstract, and it involved this guitar. In fact, what's funny is all I remember from that John Zorn rehearsal as I saw it, all I remember was Eugene Chadbourne, the guitar player, and I remember Zorn standing there with a long ponytail. That's all I remember, like down to his ass. That's all. But so I don't remember what anyone else was playing, and I remember it was sort of chaotic, and I thought it was really cool. And then somehow I go meet Bill, And I believe it was downstairs. And I don't, but downstairs in the basement. And I don't remember anything about my conversation with Bill. I
Huh.
don't remember.
And you didn't talk to Giorgio at all?
I don't remember that. There was a point. I was there a few more times, not a ton, but a few more times at Gamelski's place, and I remember him being, I guess, in the middle floor, and there was some dogs.
Right. Yeah, I've heard about the dogs and the
That
dog and the dog poop.
Yeah, I don't remember the poop, but I do remember the dogs and just thinking, oh, that's seemed very civilized or bourgeois almost a little bit. I didn't, because no one I knew had like, because they seemed like fancy dogs.
Yeah, I think they were Dobermans, but
Yes, and no one I knew had dogs unless they were their parents' dogs, right? Because everyone I knew was a freaking teenager, right? So if they had a fancy dog, it was their parents had a dog. No one really had. So I was like, oh wow, this is like a real adult here in the mix.
so 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 this is your first time meeting Bill, and and Zorn and Chadbourne are there, and is Bill playing with them?
no,
Oh, he's not. Okay, so there's some other. Oh, you say it maybe a game piece going on. So you knew who Zorn was at that point?
no, I did not know who
Oh, you did
Zorn
not.
was.
Did you know who Chadbourne was?
No, I didn't know anything.
Oh, okay. So, but they're playing music when you show up. So
Yeah,
that's
it's
your
just like
introduction.
it was just the lobby. It was the first floor, and like I opened
Ah,
the door. No one even seemed to notice. Like it wasn't a big deal. Like it was just kind of they were just hashing stuff out and improvising, and it didn't seem to fluster anyone that someone walked into the space. But yeah, I didn't know Zorn or Chadbourne or know what even I didn't know about that kind of music. I mean, I was a big fan
sure.
of Frank Zappa and used to go see him every Halloween. So I was used to the idea of these large, weird ensembles, but this
Yeah.
was even further out than Frank Zappa.
I'm going to pull up a picture here, and you tell me if this picture is at all from that time period. Uh, can you see that?
No. Oh, now.
I blow it up a little bit. Can you see it okay?
Yep.
So that's Bill Laswell and Michael Beinhorn. And give me a sense of when this picture was taken.
Right. Well, that was not at the very, very beginning. That was not, for instance, during the spring of '79 tour, for instance, because Bill wore a beret all the time. I can't really remember when he switched to a fedora, or maybe he used both.
Well, he would go back to the beret almost permanently later, right?
That's true. Yeah, permanently much later. But there was a minute there where he switched to a fedora. But I remember clearly that he was wearing a beret, and there was also a period there where he was wearing camouflage all the time. And so did John Zorn, by the way. Zorn, even to this day, Zorn wears camo pants.
Right.
So that was a kind of a staple of a sort of needing to survive, staying alive in New York City in the late '70s, right? Because somehow to act a little tougher
Oh, yeah.
was in everyone's interest for keeping safe.
So you
But
think this picture is like 79?
I think this is later. This has got to be like 1980.
Okay. And
Also, what's very clear about this is I remember it having to do with the album One Down.
oh, okay.
Yeah, because on the album One Down there was a dollar bill. So Bill,
Oh, right. I see.
right,
He's holding a dollar bill there. Yeah.
so Laswell was already thinking that as a sort of symbol.
Right.
That
And
was going to.
any story on the jacket Beinhorn's wearing there?
Can you
It
enlarge a
looks
little?
like there's some kind of animal, or yeah, an animal. It looks like maybe a leopard or something.
No, I don't remember it at all. And I don't remember that jacket at all. But I do remember. But yeah, so this has got to be. I think this was almost like a pseudo publicity shot because
Yeah,
of
it looks staged for sure.
because Laswell's partner then was a very good photographer called T. Lin, and
Aha. Yeah.
I don't remember exactly how to pronounce her last name. But it was L.E. So T. Lin Lee or Le or Le. but T-Lin, that was his partner. So there was never a photographer too far off. Also, he didn't start seeing T-Lin until a little later. So when I knew Bill, in short order, he was seeing this other woman called Jane, who I don't remember being a photographer. So that photo there that was kind of almost pseudo, like a spontaneous but yet pseudo publicity shot was probably, in fact, I know it was taken by T-Lin. So that's definitely a little later.
All right. So you've met Bill now, and what happens, with Beinhorn and Marr and yourself after that first meeting?
Well, somehow after that meeting, sometime in there, the Zu Manifestival happens. Shortly after meeting Bill, probably within months or something, and or even 1 month, not in short order. And the idea was, which I'd been already doing for, like I said, friend bands, which was sort of help out. I thought it was an important mission. Like I really thought I was like being a stage manager, roadie, tech kind of person. So it was a little more than just helping out in my mind. It was sort of a bit of a bit of at least a temporary career, at least maybe temporarily, I thought at the time, while I was in high school, during my off time.
So I just pulled up this poster from the Zu Manifestival. Can you see it?
Yep.
Yeah. So you're saying this festival, which was a pretty big deal. I mean, with the number of people that were, and this is when Gomelski brings over a lot of these people he had been working with in Europe, including David Allen, who was like one of the featured artists. Fred Frith comes over and others. You're saying this festival happens like pretty quickly after you meet Lasswell. Is that right?
That's how I remember it. Yeah.
Because this is October of '78.
Yeah, I'm feeling like I might have met Bill. Oh, you know what? October of '78. Wow, so it might really have been. I might have really just met Bill that month, even.
Huh.
Because
this
my dad
came together in a hurry then.
Because my dad. It's funny because I remember the two kind of being disconnected. My meeting Bill and then the Manifestival. But if you really look at the timeline, my dad died in like September of '78. I moved out and moved down the hill fairly quickly, and down the hill, a new apartment living with Michael Beinhorn, and then somewhere in there was, oh, you should meet Bill, and at the Zoo House. And then if you're saying this is October, I mean, then it's friggin' fast that this happened.
Well, tell us how this festival comes together and what was your involvement?
Well, at that point, like I said, I was already on the side liking the idea of. I also had this idea that somehow in tech there was a career path for me, but I wasn't sure what that was. Honestly, I didn't even know if it wouldn't be maybe being a builder of equipment. Like I thought maybe I'll build equipment, make equipment. I don't know. I thought somewhere in there.
You said you were going to school for some of that.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly when, but I took a course at the new school for about a month, where actually the project band that I brought in. So in other words, I did a little recording at the new school. Actually, not at the new school itself, but it was via the new school at a recording studio. There was a recording studio in the West Village. There was a program, and you could like bring in a band to record. And the band I brought in was 1121 that had Michael Beinhorn and Fred Marr in it. And so I think that might have been the summer of '78 before I met Bill, clearly.
Right.
So So, but even then, I didn't know exactly. So I was dabbling. Somehow, I had this vague idea that somewhere in music and sound and equipment, specifically
Right.
equipment, because I was not even thinking it was necessarily record production. I thought it might be building or even fixing stuff. I just didn't know. So the idea of just going to these places and like helping with on stage seemed related, and that's something I was willing to do. So I went to the Manifestival, assuming that I would help, and got a bit of a sort of background, um, uh, explainer from, I think, Domelsky and whoever else was more directly involved about what was going to happen and when I could do and when do all the details. So they were kind of including me, but in a very vague way. And then it turned out, like after maybe 2 hours or something of the Manifestival, that maybe I needed to step up because it was kind of chaotic and it was a lot.
So you
Of
really
equipment.
you weren't involved in any prep prior to the actual day of the event. Is that what you're saying?
I don't remember being involved in any prep before the event. Maybe I knew. I mean, I knew about it obviously for a couple of days before, and people were talking. People seemed very excited about having what they called the downtown bands. So there was the 5 downtown bands, as I remember, which included Glenn Branca's Theoretical Girls, and at that time I didn't know who Glenn Branca was, and he was the last of the 5. So of the downtown bands, he had the headlining slot. He probably played around 2 p.m. or 3 p.m., something like that. It was early on. And then somewhere after,
how long did the festival run?
as I remembered, it was something like noon to midnight. That's kind of how I remember it. But
Okay.
I remember it's supposed to be 12 hours.
And so it's a lot of local bands building up to who are the headlining bands?
I mean, I always remembered as having been Gong.
Right.
Yeah. That's also the first time I saw Fred Frith play. He played on a table. He had prepared instruments on the table. I remember helping carry the table. So if you need any real specifics of what I did in this Zu Manifestival, my claim to fame is I helped carry Frith's table. But it was not a job that should be underestimated. Damn good job carrying it, making sure nothing happened.
Great. All right, let me pull up another photo here, because the result of this festival, or one of the results, is this New York Gong band forms, and a tour is arranged, I assume by Gomelsky, a North American tour. Can you talk a little bit about that? How does New York Gong get together, and how does this tour start happening?
Well, at some point after the Manifestival, probably within 2 or 3 months, is when I knew that there's going to be a tour happening. And what I did is I incorporated the tour into my senior project. So at high school. So whatever the last month is of high school, that by coincidence. Also, spring is an important touring month, so it really makes sense. So I guess that was April or May, or so whatever it actually fit perfectly into the last month of my time in high school. So I made that my senior project, and all I would have to do was, when I came back from the tour, I'd have to like write an essay about it. Then I pitched it as like, I'm interested in getting involved in music and blah 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 to the school, and I was a little surprised that they accepted me just basically, screwing off right and on a tour with people. But
Well, I assume you did. I assume you did some work on the tour. What did you do?
I think with then it was sort of like, it's just like you need help with these things, right? You need extra hands, just very simply. So I was going to be an extra hand. I think with that tour, it was really, I think I was just called a roadie, and that's how I said it's like.
But you weren't involved in the sound setup or the mix of the live sound at that point.
No, I didn't do any of that. So I really was, which needs to be done. These days, partly a tour manager might do some of that work. So I helped carry stuff and helped organize, and I was part of little issues, like a little bit trying to get us on time, get us
Here's a
to
picture
places on
of
time.
Can you see this?
Yes.
And I tried to blow it up a little bit for you. All right, so tell us who these people are. Is this? It looks like this is the tour bus. Is this that school bus that was used for the tour?
Yeah, and I can tell you a little anecdote about making the building of the school bus, which is kind of interesting
Oh, sure.
because it had to be fitted. It had to be like, fitted with bunks and stuff, right?
Yeah.
So that someone had to do that. And so left to right there in the beret, of course, the perennial. By the way, it's maybe interesting to note that I think to this day I have not seen the top of Bill's head. and at the time we were all like, I mean, he was good. He had a way of I was like, wow, this guy's really sharp as far as like keeping a bit of a personality cult around him. Like he always maintained a little bit of distance and mystery. And weirdly enough, the hat, always headwear, always a beret, and then later it became a fedora, was always this thing. Enough that people would talk about it amongst themselves. So we're like, why does he always wear, even in the summer? Why does he wear a beret, and what's under there? Why? I mean, so that was part of his mystique.
The camouflage is on here too.
And right, and at that time there was a minute there because I was wearing camouflage too, and so I think it was one day we were in some elevator somewhere, and it was Laswell, Beinhorn, and me. We're all in camos, and Bill said, "Wow, we look like a little army or something," and he thought, and he said, "That's cool." He liked it, and I was like, "Oh, okay, sure. Maybe I'll just keep wearing. If it's cool, I'll just keep wearing the camos." And that became a bit of my look for a good like year and a half or so. But yeah, then next to Bill on going left to right, that's Michael Beinhorn. Then in the forefront is David Allen. Right behind him is Bill Bacon. To the right of Bill Bacon in the shades is Fred Marr. And then over to the right is Cliff Coltrari, who was playing guitar in what we called back then the Zoo Band.
Right.
And Beinhorn, Michael Beinhorn, and Cliff really were into a leather jacket wearing mode on that tour and through 1979. Also in the
France tour.
Also in the French tour, and then somewhere along the way, everyone switched to suit jackets, right? So it was like, I think Cliff was out, but Michael was wearing suit jackets. Fred was wearing suit jackets. He might be wearing one there, and then Bill switched to that, and then Bill switched to a fedora, and that was much more in line with the vibe of like bands like Lounge Lizards, who wore like suit jackets. That was kind of that vibe.
Yeah. And so this tour goes on for almost a month, the North American part of the tour.
Yeah. I wouldn't mind mentioning the building of the bus.
Oh, yeah, right. Go ahead.
Somewhere in there, I was told that the bus was being built, and that I could go, or I asked, or it was suggested that I go to where the school bus was being built. The way I remember it was that I went to the South Bronx, and that's where they were building the school bus. And I'm pretty sure it involved this guy, Harry, who was in Mother Gong and who was really handy and loved being handy. He loved building stuff. He could fix the truck, right? He could fix the school bus, the engine and stuff like that. So he was super handy. And so I don't quite remember him in the South Bronx building the bus, but probably he was one of the people also building the bunks. And for some reason, I remember having to find the school bus, and it was in this area that was very typically of the South Bronx that was in ruins. It had been arsoned, so there was a lot of debris all over the place. I had to find it, and I spotted it because there was some Tibetan prayer flags sort of attached on something from a pole and onto the school bus, and then they were like blowing in the wind. So I'm crossing the debris field in the South Bronx, and I'm like, oh, I guess that's where the bus is. And I saw these like Tibetan prayer flags. So and then I don't remember what happened. It was just one time, but I guess that they were building. Since I was going to help and I was going to be roadieing, I guess it made sense I would go and see the bus being built.
Sure. So on this month-long tour, what events stand out in your mind? I mean, this is 40 years ago.
Yeah, just well, very few really have stuck in my memory. I remember Louisville for some reason because we stayed at someone's house who apparently is even now in Louisville, like a big music lover, and him having been sort of hosting a bit the Gong tour is even still now is a bit of this person's like story even now in Louisville. Like other people in Louisville know that he hosted this infamous tour because also that's not a typical tour stop is Louisville, Kentucky.
Uh-huh.
But I remember that. I remember staying at his house, and that was the first time I'd ever been in that kind of situation. I never left New York. Basically, I'd never been in the Midwest, let alone the South. And then I remember a place in Colorado. I think it was Fort Collins, outside of Fort Collins, near an army base or a military base, and we played a anti-nuke. It was like an anti-nuke event, kind of protest or whatever. And it was one of these like glass churches, right? It was like one of these like glass modern, I guess, evangelical or whatever churches, and there was a lot of ironies there because they were like supporting these very 60s, very 60s looking freaks.
Is that where the gig was?
That was where the gig was somehow.
Huh.
Because I remember outside the gig, standing in, I guess what maybe was the lobby or the front area, and talking to some of the people that were theater goers, and there was military people. So we played in a church, and I guess Colorado was probably evangelical of some sort. It was like a modern church, glass, and then I remember speaking to a service member who was saying, "Oh." Plus, I was just going. I didn't really. I knew about the anti-nuke movement, but I wasn't really involved in that part of the planning. I just knew that it was an anti-nuke event,
Sure.
and
What,
the
what?
person.
You're 19?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
No. I'm 18.
18 maybe.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm speaking to basically a soldier, and he was like, "I really support you guys. I really support this movement." I remember
Uh,
that, and then that was sort of really striking to
Sure.
me.
Well, these people are all fans of David Allen and Gong. I assume, that's how this tour was probably set up. Either David
Yeah.
Allen and Gomelski knew about, where the Gong records were selling, because Gong had been a big deal in France for years, before Gomelski brings David Allen, to New York. So what do you remember about David Allen? Because his reputation in Europe was, the pixie thing, that it was very hippie, and he was doing like prog hippie type music. And then in New York, he kind of changes his image. What was he like to work with on this tour?
Well, he was still in hippie mode. He segued pretty quickly into something that was happening all over the East Village, which was there was these hippie punk hybrids. Some of them worked at the gardens or even had gardens, like these sort of anarchist, collectivist gardens that were strewn about the debris of the Lower East Side, right? So there was this, like hippies in leather jackets kind of vibe, tie-dye and leather jacket and like dreads or something. And so David Allen hadn't switched to that mode yet during this US tour. He was still very much like hippie, and then I think like he would wear like weird shoes with like little wraparound points, and like and then like a pixie hat. So there was absolutely no doubt that there was no punk yet in him during that tour, which was very interesting. Also, intersecting with Middle America. I remember a time in some very Middle American state. I want to say Nebraska, but I don't know. Maybe it was Iowa, something like that, right? And I remember we were in a diner and he ordered scallops, and then, not surprisingly, felt that they weren't real scallops, and then sort of sent it back and would not pay for the scallops. And so I witnessed the police being called. It was
Oh,
like it was like middle America, sheriffs in like kind of Stetsons kind of vibe. They were friendly enough. There was no incident. I think, but they were just, it was so obvious that they were just culture shocked and bemused of this like super tall British person in a British accent. Or he's not British. Yeah, he's British,
he's
right? Or,
from Australia originally, but
yeah,
he spent a lot of time in England. You know, he forms Soft Machine with Robert Wyatt.
yeah.
In fact, he was a boarder. This is a great story. That's part of the Gomelski Recordings book that I'm working on, where the beginnings of Soft Machine. Um, David Allen was a boarder at Robert Wyatt's family's house, and he was kind of a brother figure to Robert Wyatt, and so they spent a lot of time together. Wyatt was much younger, but anyway, they end up forming Soft Machine later on, and then Alan gets stranded in France because of his visa problems, and he can't join up with Soft Machine back in England, and time goes on, and he just gives up. I guess that he's going to get back, so he forms Gong. Gomelski's involved with Soft Machine, and then he ends up leaving England for France, and that's all part of the Gomelski story. But here we are in North America touring with what will be called New York Gong. You say on this tour it was actually a Gong tour, right?
Yeah, I'd never heard it being referred to as a New York Gong tour, or it being talked about that way, or being promoted that way. Although I guess there's evidence that sometimes it was promoted that way. I
Yeah,
don't know.
in that Zoo Festival poster, there were references to New York Gong, but there were
Yeah,
also references to Gong, David Allen and Gong. And I believe at the same time, back in France, uh, there was another version of Gong, Pierre Morland's Gong.
yeah,
So there
that
may have been some issue there, with who owned the rights to the name Gong.
right. That could have been that, but I remember, certainly to us, we kept talking about it as David Allen's Gong. That's what we
David
talked about
Allen's
it.
Gong, right?
But just to finish my story, if I may, is so
Sure.
we're in this diner. Um, David Allen sends the scallops back, diner in like Nebraska or Iowa, somewhere like that. The police are called, and there's these like two sheriffs, very bemused by the sight of Allen in full pixie mode, with like a beard like this, like moons all over what almost looks like pajamas or something. And he's very friendly with a big smile on his face. They're not scallops. I am not going to pay for them. And it wasn't. It was just interesting, just witnessing that culture shock.
Sure.
Actually, I was culture shocked by David Allen, honestly. So I totally get it, but it was interesting seeing that actual intersection. And there were other incidents of him intersecting with Middle America that I don't exactly remember.
Yeah.
I think that one moment I remember, which I think people have different memories of, is, for one thing, I was very surprised at seeing people meditate, because I hadn't really. That was not part of my experience. I didn't know people that meditated. All I knew was like, you know, punk ass teenagers in Manhattan, and everyone. It was just not happening. We were just, no one was meditating. I thought that was a relic of the '60s. I'd never witnessed it too much for myself. And I remember glancing out away from, I want to say like a truck stop or something, and then Alan away from the parking lot by himself, and it was like I could see him looking out over this sort of prairie, kind of bucolic prairie and maybe farmland of Middle America beyond him, and he was like meditating, and then I kind of noticed him like move his hand like this, and I was like, oh, Wow. So I just never seen anything like that. To me, it was like just surprising. And also I remember, which I feel like I should almost inject an apology, because I remember we were really goofing on Mark Kramer, or as he likes to be called, Kramer, on his meditating. I'd never seen it. I thought, to me, I was like, can you imagine me being an asshole who went to school in the Bronx? And I was like, oh shit, well, that's some crazy shit. You know, that was me. And like we would do crazy shit, like he'd be meditating, and then we'd like put stuff in his toes. I remember someone like trying to fuck with him. So basically, we thought like people meditating was some just crazy business, at least to me. You know, you know. So I was very. I remember being shocked when I realized that people believed in reincarnation at some point in this time period. So I was really not connected with that world. Generally, I thought of the New Age movement that was sort of like just burgeoning up at that point as totally horrible, and I want nothing to do with it. And I remember Laswell during that tour, because I remember when we were going through Arizona, and I thought that was incredible. Like I loved Arizona. I'd never been anywhere. Like I was looking out the windows, and I was amazed in Arizona that that Laswell and Michael Beinhorn were up in the bunk like a lot. And I was like, what the fuck? Do you see what's right outside the window? This is incredible. And I was just like, I just couldn't get it. I was like, oh, really? You're not curious, huh? I didn't get it. And I remember Laswell saying to me in response to my annoyance, don't give me any of that spiritual crap. And I was like, I'm not giving you any spiritual crap. Definitely, that's not coming from me. But that was the vibe a little bit amongst us, and it was a bit in contrast with the sort of like legacy hippies that we had on
you guys from New York City, had you been outside of the New York City area much?
No, this was the first time I'd been cross country. Actually, it's worth remembering because it just popped back into my head. I remember being in Ann Arbor on the Gong tour. And Bill got me very excited about Ann Arbor. He was like, "It's a great town."
Yeah, that's his home. That's his home area, right?
Yeah, because also Iggy Pop was sort of nearby or intersected with Ann Arbor. I think even some Black Panthers were in Ann Arbor before moving to Oakland, California. So I was very excited about Oakland, and I remember the streets of I'm sorry, not Oakland, the streets of Ann Arbor. And I remember us being on the streets there. That was very exciting. And then the other thing I remember quite well was the scene in Los Angeles. That was a bona fide. That was one of the things where you're like, wow, this tour has some real high points, and it's very successful. That in my view was a very successful show. There was like hundreds of people in LA. Also, an interesting feature of this tour is when Gamelski was around, which wasn't all the time. I remember he flew in at one point during this tour.
Yeah,
he flew in and joined the tour at some point in the middle.
I see.
And I think it might have been St. Louis or something, but we basically picked him up at the airport. And
then he traveled around on the bus with you guys?
Yeah, a little bit. So basically it wasn't all the time. That's for sure. Whether he stayed and then left, that I can't quite remember. But when he was on the tour, he would open the show. He would be up there with like a drink or a cigarette or something like that, and like speak. He'd do a little soliloquy, which usually describing like the deity of Zu. And it would commonly end with him saying that when the music changes, beware, because the city walls will collapse. So he would end with that. That would be his last words before like, and now the show begins. So I remember that, and I think I remember him really milking it in LA. Yeah,
there's a YouTube video of portions of the LA show. It's not great quality because I think it was shot on Super 8 or something, but it's an interesting document looking at some of the performance from the LA show. It only shows the Gong band, I don't know if there's any footage of the Zu band around, but that's kind of fun to look at. Um, um, by the time you guys get back to New York, you're headed for New York Gong kind of goes, David Allen goes and starts recording the New York Gong album about time. And Lasswell and Beinhorn and what's called Zu Band then heads also into the studio up in the Woodstock area to record some of the very first material stuff. That stuff was recorded at Levon Helm studio by Eddie Offord, the famous Prague engineer. Were you there for any of that recording in Woodstock?
I don't think so. I remember being in Woodstock for other things related to us, but I don't think it was that. So I don't think I had anything to do with the New York Gong record or even Temporary Music 1.
Right. The creative hub apparently in the area was the Creative Music Studio, where a lot of musicians that would end up contributing to the downtown scene, they studied at the Creative Music Studio, which was started by Ornette Coleman and others. Were you familiar with the Creative Music Studio at the time?
Yeah, somewhere around this time, probably, I don't know, a year after, very compressed period of time back then, of culturally and in my life, somewhere in there within a year. I remember being up there, particularly remember being up there with Tom Cora, because he was a cello player, and I'm pretty sure that was for Curlew.
Yeah.
Which involved George Cartwright, who had been actually, I guess, a part of New York Gong or whatever in France on that tour. So
right.
I immediately was sort of segueing at that point into participating in recordings.
Right. Yeah, but that happens after the Gong France tour, right?
Pretty sure that was after
Yeah.
There might have been something in there where I did something in New York or went along, because it wasn't very clear that I was wanting to be a recording engineer.
Sure.
And I'm also not entirely, I'm not sure I understood then what the difference was really between a recording engineer and a producer or a co-producer, or how there were different roles in a studio.
Well, sometimes there wasn't a lot of difference. I mean, Eddie Offord was usually only credited as being an engineer, but he was clearly playing the role of producer on a lot of those classic Prague albums.
Yeah, so basically, I would show up at these in the studio for some of these recordings that were burgeoning up there, but particularly with material. Like, for instance, there was the slow murder discourse single,
right?
And then, of course, Temporary Music 2. I was really showing up as a kind of member of the extended.
Well, you have an engineering credit on, or you have a production credit on those two songs. Anyway, I want to get to that in a minute because that happens after the Temporary Music 1 recording, which is the very first recordings of material. And then soon after that, the French tour happens, right?
I believe so, yeah.
So you get back from the North American tour. Material goes to Woodstock, records a certain number of songs. 4 of them end up on Temporary Music 1. And there's something in the works for this France tour. Do you know how the French tour came together? Because it looks like Gomelsky isn't so involved in the French tour like he was in the North American tour. Is that right?
I don't remember Gomelsky in France. I remember that one of the, I think there was sort of a promoter. I can almost remember his name, a promoter and his wife that were sort of the tour managers or something for the French tour. And I remember a conversation, pretty sure, between Gomelsky and that person. And I remember them speaking in French. There's a slight chance that I'm confusing Gomelsky with Jean Caracos. There's a chance that because in my brain they were very similar kind of people, same age.
Yeah.
Both.
Caracos was the head of Celluloid Records, right?
Yeah, so I could be mixing it up, but I'm pretty sure it was Gomelsky. This was before it was settled that I was going to France, right? Going to France was a bigger deal because I wanted to pay my plane ticket for one thing. Right. You know, it wasn't like, so it was a bigger commitment to bring me along. Bill was strongly advocating for me to be on the tour and to come to help. Someone who was French was talking to Gomelsky and didn't understand why I needed to be there, and didn't understand what kind of experience I had that I could bring that would help. And Gomelsky said to this person, I remember even the word in French that I really, il sait vraiment comme se débrouiller, something like that. But débrouiller means to work, to get out of problems, right? So I really know how to figure stuff out.
And apparently you speak French.
And I speak French. Yeah, I speak French because I used to go before going to high school in the Bronx. I went to the French school, the Lycée Français in Manhattan. So yeah, I spoke French. So
well, that alone would have, you were probably the only guy on the tour who spoke French.
Oh, that's true. So well, aside from this tour manager who I think was there almost the whole time, so there was a French person that was kind of our handler.
Well, you must have been interpreting almost the whole time you were there.
I don't remember a lot of that because French has become so easy for me, obviously, because I speak it fluently. So I was like, yeah, but I remember speaking French. And I don't remember that being a factor, but thinking back on it, did it really hurt that I spoke French? And so basically, here's the thing. It might be worth noting that Gomelsky's nickname for me was Smartin. In fact, even a little further, he used to call me Young Smartin. So he was always calling me, he was addressing me as Young Smartin, blah, 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 Young Smartin. So I think he was very well aware of my youthful energy, and also very aware that he thought I was like kind of smart and analytical, which I still am. And that's part of my MO really, even in the recording studio now. But already at the time I was showing a sort of thoughtfulness, and I was very inquisitive.
Yeah, and it's a play on Martin too.
Right. So I think that his perception of me was that I could be very good to have on this French tour. So he was a proponent of it. You know, it's funny. It's worth mentioning. I'm remembering all this stuff that on the bus, on the spring tour on the bus, someone wrote, and I was like, first I was confused. If I was confused by someone wrote a little graffiti in the bus somewhere, without Martin and Harry was the guy that had built the school bus basically and was maintaining it and was in Mother Gong. I think he was a partner, actually romantic partner of Jilly Smythe. This guy Harry, it said, without Martin and Harry, there would be no questions and answers. Someone wrote that, and I'm like, what does that mean? And then I guess it was explained to me that exactly that I was very inquisitive and always asking questions about things, but Harry was a bit of a know-it-all.
Uh-huh.
So Harry always had an answer for everything, and I, if anything, had a question about everything. And so anyway, so that setup of like how people saw me is why maybe people said, bring him on the French tour. Also, you could see in Laswell's really advocating for me to come to the tour is that by hook or crook, Bill was a big advocate of making me a part of things. So he was almost forcing it a little bit. So even if I wasn't that much of a part of it, or it was just a bit marginal, still it would be produced by Material and Martin Bisi. So even if I didn't have that much a part of it, I was just dabbling, just slightly getting involved, produced by Martin Bisi and Material. I think he really wanted to sort of kind of groom me really into being like a co-producer or like an engineer, because Bill is not that technical. You know, Bill is not very technical in terms of the knobs and actually how the gear works. And he saw more potential in that with me and thought that let's make this team a little more happen. So I think you see that in all regards. So, you know, if you see co-produced on by me on Temporary Music 2, but there was still in that studio in Pennsylvania, there were still recording engineers, and I wasn't even sure what I'd be doing. So his crediting was a bit generous, but you could see his intention was like really pushing me in there, making me feel a part of it, getting my loyalty, which I was giving.
Yeah. Yes. So, do you remember how long the French tour lasted? I think it's a little about 6 weeks or something like that.
Yeah, and funny, I was about to say definitely a month, but maybe a little more than a month.
Yeah. So, and what were some of the highlights for you on that tour, or lowlights?
I mean, I just remember dumb tour stuff. I remember people trying to freak me out about ghosts. I remember being in like someplace we were going to sleep, and there was like an old kind of, it seemed like some medieval castle kind of situation. And then I sort of was in my own room for some weird reason because other people were sharing. I don't know. I just ended up in a room by myself. So people were messing with me and like getting under the bed and like in the middle of the night, and like I'd wake up and the bed was moving, this kind of stuff. And then I'm like, oh my God. And then I hear people snicker, and then it would be Bill and Fred Mark like having fucked with me.
So France is David Allen's like a home base for Gong. Gong was like well known. What were the shows like? Do you remember? And especially compared to the North American shows, did you notice much difference between the audience?
Well, the shows in France were more consistent. They were more like all the same, whereas there was some poorly attended shows on the North American tour, and there were some that were like, whoa, stunningly a lot of people. And the French tour, I just remember as being more all medium, and that's a good thing in a way.
Right.
All I remember is on that tour, I ended up handling the lights because we brought our own lights. So I'd handle the lights and do like I had the little board, and I would completely freak the fuck out. So I was doing as insane of lights as possible, flashing lights, strobe, moving around. And as you'll recall, what I'd already been, like I said, I was in previously I'd been in theater class in high school, and I also was helping with the staging with that proto material band called 1121 and handling the fog machine and actually drowning out the members once with the fog machine. So I was into this whole thing of like going all the way in whatever possible role I was having. So the lights were getting probably way too much, but no one said anything.
So between the Gong band and the Zu band, the musical style was quite different, right?
I thought so. I think the Zu band was already playing. Also, by the way, it's worth noting, Laswell came up with the name Material during the North American spring tour. He didn't really apply it right away, but I remember him coming up with the name Material. Like he like wrote it on a piece of paper and liked the way it looked or something like that. But I don't know when that actually took hold. I guess very, very possibly on the French tour it was not the Zu band and it was called Material.
Maybe, yeah. Well, this could have to do with Gomelski's involvement ending with Material, because clearly Zu Band was an extension of Zu House and Zu Manifestival and all this Zu stuff that was really Gomelski, right?
Yeah, I mean, just the name of the band. I mean, that strikes me as one of these things where people didn't have a great band name, and then they just went with something that kind of just works. Like Zu.
Well, and Gomelski also had Zu Records. The very first Material album was released on Zu Records.
Yeah, so
before Celluloid.
It just made sense, but it's not like Zu band had to use the name Zu. I don't think it just was. It seemed like it was just convenient, and it had a bit of status to it, you know. So the Zu band could be say, yeah, it's the house band in a way, the pickup band maybe even
Right.
for some of these big legends, and that also started Laswell's trajectory in sort of being a sponsor of like legacy artists, like legends, like throughout his career. Even now, Bill really gravitates towards like rehabilitating and supporting and inserting himself into records and tours or whatever of like legacy artists. And we would see that later, obviously, with like Herbie Hancock and Ginger Baker and these people, you know,
Right.
where he loves that
Right.
getting the legends back into the fold. So as a supporter of Zu Band that would support Gong, that fit into like his MO as a producer later on.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that first Material EP, Gomelski was credited as the producer for that, and I got a really great story from the sax player Don Davis about Gomelski producing him in the studio, very forcefully, apparently. I guess I never met Gomelski, but he was apparently a pretty large man and very expressive. Would you say that was the case?
Yeah, he had a very fiery personality, and he was very imposing.
Uh-huh.
He, you know, actually, I think that's something that Bill Laswell really admired about Gomelski. I think Gomelski was a bit of a role model for like an older person in the music industry, like a maverick,
Yeah.
of the music industry that sort of got his way, made stuff happen, and had this sort of intimidating. Because it really took people like really knowing Gomelski to kind of stand up to him on stuff. So there wasn't a lot of that happening. It was really the people that had a long history with him that would really even complain about anything. He was kind of intimidating, you know, and Bill even commented about that, how like, wow, like when he commands a room,
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
and he's in there, it's his way and he dominates. And Bill really admired that about Gomelski.
Sure. We were talking about you know, the personality of Gomelski and how you know, he was involved in the North American tour, but he wasn't on the French tour. Um, and
Well, I think Gomelski was in the conversation prior to the French tour, just simply because I remember that time where he was advocating with the French tour manager or whatever
I see. So he helped set it up.
for me to be there. I just remember that indicates some involvement.
Right. Yeah. Um, but he didn't go to France. I mean,
I do not remember him being in France. Yeah.
right. So how do you remember?
Even with the North American tour, I remember him flying in at one point.
Sure.
So he wasn't really about to be like in a school bus bunk or however we traveled.
Well, did you sleep on the school bus bunk?
Oh, I definitely did on the North American tour. In the French tour, as things are in Europe, we always had accommodations after every show, and often it was community-based accommodations. It wasn't really like something set up by like the venue. And I remember traveling in a separate vehicle on the French tour. I traveled with the sound man.
Uh-huh. Okay. Um, so were the accommodations better in France than the North American tour, or?
Probably better, but at that point, I didn't really care about anything. I think France was just also much more interesting. So we would stay in like crazy homes or farms even. I do remember there was a recording snuck into the French tour that might be worth finding, or I'm not even sure it went anywhere. I just remember being in this kind of home ad hoc recording studio in kind of a farmhouse or something, very rural area of France. It seemed like people that maybe David Allen knew, and I didn't really at that point. I actually still was not yet participating in recordings, but I remember it happening and I was observing it, and I feel it was just one evening even, but it was something. And
Uh-huh.
I think I remember George Cartwright participating in that recording, but it seemed that it had to do very much with Gong. So it was like the Flying Teacup record or just something. I don't even know if those recordings went anywhere, but they snuck in a little recording on the French tour. It's worth
Sure.
it.
I imagine there's a lot of David Allen bootlegs floating around.
Yeah, could be for sure.
So how did that tour end?
Well, I don't really remember what the last show was or anything like
I
that.
mean, you guys have been together for a while on this tour. Were you all still, friendly, or were there any tensions that had built up by the time you're getting ready to come back? Because there was this little quote on the internet that the Americans on the tour found that they didn't enjoy the European way of life, whatever that means. And um, does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, it does make sense a little bit.
So what is meant by that?
Well, for instance, I remember in New York one day around that time, uh, Bill went to see a French film, I guess with subtitles or something. It's kind of it was an important French film. And then he came back and he said he wasn't into it. And he basically said that he wasn't into it because he couldn't relate to any of the characters. And I kind of feel like generally the personalities and the lifestyle with an emphasis on quality of life and comfort, and very sort of genteel and proper in a way, was not very inspiring to Bill and wasn't really what he thought was a good environment even for the kind of creativity that he wanted. Bill was used to, this might be overstating it, but basically he was used to kind of war zones. He
Sure.
went to he would Bill, prior to even coming to New York, had been on tours with like funk bands in the South, where he was the only white man.
Uh-huh.
And he told me of at least one story of like a really scary rub with law enforcement somewhere in a place like Alabama or something like that, but basically deep South.
Yeah.
So that's one experience. Then he comes from Detroit. And then he
Yeah.
moves to New York, and he's wearing camouflage in New York because you kind of have to if you want to survive a little bit. Any little bit of extra armor that you can use in New York at that time.
Yeah.
So he thinks, and as I thought also, that's a good place for art to come from.
Uh-huh.
I still think that the best art comes from situations that are kind of where there's like conflict somehow.
Sure. Yeah.
And so I think that in France, that maybe that was a general sense about the French way. But I don't think I really manifest in any kind of toxic kind of way. I don't think Bill told anyone. I don't think he told anyone to fuck off, or I didn't see anything like that. So I don't think it. I think maybe that it was more private. And
Bill got along well with David Allen, didn't he?
Yeah, I think that the Brits are a little closer to us in terms of culture, and I think that
He's
France.
Australian. Again, he's Australian.
Yeah, excuse me. But I think that there was
But at that point he's almost French, because he spent so much time in France that I assume he was fluent in French too. Probably you and he were probably the only two guys on the tour.
Yeah, I think that Alan was a little more up Bill's alley, and maybe he knew Alan better at that point than to like stick him into some sort of stereotype of how he viewed Europeans and French people.
Right.
But there's a disconnect there. Alan did forge so much music in Britain, and the British don't even call themselves Europeans, right? They refer to the continent as Europe. So I don't know. I think if there was a little bit of a no love lost of
Yeah.
like the French culture when we came back. What's interesting to note is that we came back from the French tour. It was time to get the loft, as we called it, going, because I had rented the loft before leaving on the French tour.
I see.
I rented the space in Gowanus in Brooklyn, which became OAO Recording Studio, which is right behind me here, and then of course became BC Studio. I rented the space in August of 1979.
Aha.
And then did not really proceed to do much. I think I moved some stuff in, spent a little. I remember spending some nights here. I don't know, not much, a month, 2 months, and then boof, we were on our way to France. So when we got back from France, it was the big deal of getting the space ready, which included, I don't even know why, but we included putting cork on all. I didn't know what priorities I should even have. Also, this was just going to be a rehearsal room initially. So
Right.
somehow I thought that I needed to put, because it was brick, which was really bright and kind of nasty for sound. So I felt compelled to put cork on all the walls, which you can kind of, I hope, see in the background.
Yeah. Yeah. I can
Cork
see.
is brown. All the walls are brown around me. So I put in the cork, and there's a brown carpet, which is weird. Kind of a good choice on color if it's going to last 45 years. And then actually it was soon enough because we started doing we got it primarily as a place to rehearse and who knows, right? So
Yeah.
I immediately had to put in these acoustic tiles because there was a neighbor 2 flights up that was complaining about Bill's bass playing. Of course he could hear it. So I was like, fuck, I'm gonna have to put in these like acoustic
Probably
tiles.
shakes the whole building.
Yeah, well, Bill actually played like a 6-string bass at that time a lot. So he wasn't so much into bomb the bass yet. But yeah, anything that's in low frequencies, yes, is going to vibrate. But he wasn't as dubby back then. He was more of like into a 6-string bass that had a certain twang, sounded very like American. It's almost like bluegrass mixed with like blues bass or something. It was unusual, very finger hammer on and a 6-string bass. You can hear it on like Memory Serves. There's a lot of 6-string bass.
Sure.
So basically, the big task coming back from France was working on the space, and everyone chipped in a bit. I remember Fred Marr chipping in, helping with the acoustic tiles. Everyone hated my choices. No one liked the acoustic tiles. They thought it was ugly, looked like an office. So we didn't agree on any of that stuff. Cliff Coltreri even helped me put up some of the cork. So when we got back from French tour is launching our sort of like more proper iteration of what material would become, which was a production team, and having a home base was a massive part of that. But we had to prepare the home base somewhere after coming back from the French tour, maybe because I even saw that little bit of a quick recording in this farmhouse, because at that point I'd never been in a sort of home private recording studio. I'd only been in these like places that actually seemed like professional recording studios. So to see it in like a farmhouse somewhere in France sort of was like, oh, I guess you could just get some stuff, right? As long as you have the room. So then immediately coming back from the French tour, started thinking about getting some. So it was really fast. Like, let's get on it and getting some recording gear. I made what everyone thought was some poor choices on what gear to get because I couldn't finish the job. Like probably what everyone thought I should get was get 8-track, an 8-track board, 8-track tape machine, which would have been cheaper, but at least we could have done some work. But I kind of overshot the wad, ran out of money, and just didn't really have enough to finish the.
Who was financing it?
Well, at that point, I had some inheritance from my dad dying in the fall of 1978. And my mom had already died a few years prior to that, so there was some money from inheritance, and then that ran out. So I ran out of that in between paying the rent, getting the space, because initially I paid the rent, and people kind of chipped in a bit. Wasn't a lot of rent.
Wasn't there some funding from Eno for some work that you did prior?
Yeah. But so basically, I spent money. That's probably one of the reasons I ran out of money on audio gears, because I spent money on the space itself, which was like some soundproofing, the tiles, and the cork on the walls. That adds up. So I ran out of money basically, and then there was two schemes, and one scheme, the first scheme was to interest Brian Eno in contributing to a space, a sort of ad hoc recording studio in an industrial part of Brooklyn.
Right.
And that was right up Eno's alley at that point in time, because it was New York, it was underground, it was also in a weird place and weird people and some sort of weird process. And Eno loves process and studying process. And it was in an industrial warehouse. So that was ambient in itself, just because it was a large room and we were like in this place with like people like lighting fires outside the building and stuff. So we brought Eno into it, and then also around the time or soon after Eno, Bill organized all this, right? So Bill organized Jean Caracos, the owner of Celluloid, to pay half the rent, or actually to pay all the rent. So that was $500 a month. So Bill was actually very proactive with getting the funding after I ran out of money. So basically, we did have a bit of an agreement, like a sort of a partnership where he was, because I was not up to that. I didn't have the social skills or the background or even the evident talent or this knowledge to really convince anyone that I could start a recording studio or any of this kind of stuff. It was Bill who had that. Bill couldn't actually, or didn't really even want to actually do the nitty gritty of the recording studio. He certainly didn't want to help that much in terms of like maintaining the space itself. So that fell on me, which I was very happy about. And he took care of the job, which I knew I couldn't even handle at that age. I was still a teenager, which is deal with like heavy hitters like Brian Eno and people with all this experience like Sean Caracos or even Gamelski for that matter. So Bill, being older, a good 5 years older than me, so he handled that. So he arranged the financing of the studio, really.
Yeah. So you get back from this France tour and things really start happening. Sounds like this mix of people is just exactly the right mix for this explosion of activity that's about to happen. A lot of it in that studio where you are now. And I really want to talk to you about some of those early recordings. And we've been talking for a while now, and I really appreciate it, Martin. So let's save this conversation for these early material and other recordings that you did for our next session. And I want to thank you for all of this information on how this all came together. These are great stories. And I look forward to talking to you again, Martin.
Cool. Yeah, I look forward to another session. Wow, you were really right. Because when you said I need a good 2 hours, I was like, really? 2 hours? Do I have 2 hours worth? And in fact, it looks like we really could have used 3 hours, right? So
yeah,
there you go.
The only thing that's missing here is the beer and the bar. I wish that we were together in a bar somewhere, because that would make this perfect.
Cheers. Here's coffee. Thank you.